Hello, I'm Bob Reese, and this is Books in the World, the longest running book interview show on television. Today I'm pleased to welcome a new good friend, Jacqueline Murray Lorning, whose book, Vietnam Veterans Unbroken, is her latest entry in her field of writing. Jacqueline, tell me a little bit about yourself, maybe about some of your other books before we talk about this book.
Well, I'm a longtime resident of Cape Cod. My husband and I lived in Monument Beach for 40 years, but we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2012. And so while I was on the Cape, I facilitated the Cape Cod Screenwriters Group. I was the executive director of the Cape Cod Writers Center for more than 10 years. Mostly while I was here, I worked as an editor for other people's books. And I've been writing for a good long time.
It's good to know that you're an editor. I think people who are writing books need editors very, very much. I know this because I have one of my own that is very important to me. Tell me about the books that you've written before the one we're going to talk about today.
Well, a couple of them are here. In the 1980s and 1990s, I would go to the Joiner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences at UMass Boston. Mm-hmm. They had a 2-week writers conference, and so in 2002 and 2012, I published 2 anthologies of the work of folks from the Joiner Center, mm-hmm. and a couple of books in between. In 2012, among the things that happened to me that year, including moving, was that I won the DERA International Irish Poetry Prize.
Very nice.
And thank you for my book, The History of Bearing Children, which is, I call it one woman's journey on surviving the peace after Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And so part of the prize was my daughter and I went to Ireland, and the launch was in Galway, and then they took me through Ireland on a book tour.
Wonderful.
So,
what a nice thing to do.
And then I moved to Albuquerque, and then they have an organization there called Southwest Writers, and they wanted to put together institutional memoir for something called the Chemo Theater. Mm-hmm. It's Pueblo Deco design, built in 1927, and the man who built it and the architect, they traveled to all the pueblos and picked up different design ideas, and the inside has a mural of all of the pueblos, and if you stay, when the lights go out, there are skulls that go across the proscenium arch, and the lights are red. The eyes are red when the lights go out. So it's quite a historical building in Albuquerque.
Sounds very striking.
So while I was doing that, the publisher bought this one. Mm-hmm. So I ended up working on the editing and the indexing for 2 books at the same time.
Very busy time.
Yes.
Well, tell me a little bit what prompted you to do the book that you did, the Vietnam Veterans book, and how did you go about that?
I think I've probably been writing this book for 50 years. July 19th, 2019, I will be married to my husband, an in-country Vietnam veteran with post-traumatic stress for 50 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's kind of amazing, 50 years. So for the first 25 years or so of that marriage, I knew really nothing about Vietnam. Obviously, I knew my husband was in Vietnam, but whenever the conversation came up, he would say he had a good tour because he worked in a hospital. He was a medic. And so he never wanted to tell me anything more. And so years and years went by. I have 3 daughters, 2 adopted sons. We were foster parents. And all those years, Vietnam was just sort of nothing that could be talked about in the house. So the first 25 years of the marriage, Vietnam was just this like shadow, this invisible presence in the room all the time. And then in the late 1980s and 1990s, he started to deal with the trauma from Vietnam. He became involved with the Vietnam Veterans Outreach Center that was on Main Street. It's now the Veterans Outreach, so they do all veterans now. Became involved with them, and I sort of went along, for what he was doing. I was able to co-chair 2 of the moving wall committees that we had at the Village Green in Hyannis. And so, like I say, I think I've been writing this book for a very long time.
Well, you mentioned that he didn't want to talk about it. And one of the things that comes through in reading this book to me is how common an experience that was for most of the veterans that you interviewed. They didn't want to talk about it with anyone, even other veterans at first.
Right.
And that was one of the commonalities I saw all through the book. Let's talk about how you went about organizing the book, because you obviously had to have a lot of help in contacting the veterans, recruiting them to be part of this book. Tell us about that.
Well, the beginning part of it was very easy. I on a particular day, was at the non-vet's office with my husband, who was president of the association, and Jack Benino, who was the director of counseling. And we were just sitting around, and some of the other people that were there were telling a little bit of stories about things that had happened to them in country. And when they got to talking about their wives and their children and what they had done with the rest of their life, we sort of had a conversation about that's the story that's really not told. And so everybody kind of said, gee, somebody should write a book. Hello, Jacqueline. So that was actually the moment that propelled me to write this book. But I was very lucky because Jack Benino was supporting the book, and my husband was the president of the association. They put a blurb in their newsletter asking any veteran who would like to tell their story to self-select. So that's, with the exception of 4, that's how every one of them came to me. So many veterans, probably 5 or 6 or 7, were involved in the project over the years, but telling their story, just all of those remembrances became too much for them.
So when that went into the newsletter, did it take very long before you had 17 altogether? How did that work?
2 of the veterans came immediately. One of them was Michael Burns, and the book is done A to Z, so Burns to Watkins. So he was one of the first people, and I was terrified because I didn't really know if a Vietnam veteran who is 68 years old or 72 years old, who has really never talked about Vietnam to anybody, maybe their spouse at some point, maybe a counselor, but would they talk to me? And I was very, very worried about that. But Michael just was able to talk to me and relaxed, and the questionnaires that I gave him, the first one, the beginning was just name and address and when you were in Vietnam and that kind of thing. The last couple of questions were the crux of what I wanted to get to in this book, which was, what can Vietnam veterans talk to new veterans about from their own experience that might make living after Bosnia or Afghanistan or Iraq easier for newer vets and, of course, their families. And a couple of the guys just came forward right away. And then slowly, through the early part of 2012, we moved to Albuquerque in October. So the majority of them came forward during that time. We came back 2 years later, and a couple of more joined the process. And nowadays, with technology, it's easy to talk on the phone or do email or whatever. So when I came back in 2014, a couple of veterans were recommended to me, but also 5 or 6 of them had dropped out. One had moved away. And so I said I went to the Joiner Center Writers Workshop for years, where all of the faculty and the majority of the students were all either Vietnam veterans or had something to do with war. And so I had become very, very good friends with 3 of them. And so I asked all 3 of them, because I already knew their stories. One of them was Preston Hood, who ends up on the cover. One of them is Gary Rafferty, and the other is Pauline Hebert, who's the only woman in the book and a nurse. And so I added them, which brought me up to 18. And then just as the book was really coming together, one of the veterans dropped out, so there were 17.
I see. Now, you mentioned a questionnaire. Did that evolve over the course of the writing of the book? Did you have a questionnaire that you began to modify as you went along, or did it spring out of your head in whole right away?
I wish I had a really smart answer to this. The first questionnaire, I wish I could tell you I went to a course or I talked to some scholar or something, but in fact that's not what happened. The first questionnaire, I just wanted to see if anybody would talk to me. The two things that were important was name, address, rank, and all that kind of thing. And if there was a group of Iraqi veterans in this room, would you talk to them? Would you share your experience? And that's really what the first questionnaire was. The answers came back just amazing. And so the second questionnaire was much more complicated. And by the second questionnaire, I really knew what the end game was. I knew what I needed them to tell me in some way, shape, or form that would fit into what I expected the narrative to be. So the third questionnaire, by the time I got to the third questionnaire, I already knew the veterans enough to call them on the phone or send them a question by email and say, can you clarify this, or I forgot to ask you this, could you? So it was much more specific by the time the third questionnaire came. But by then I also knew what I wanted the narratives to look like.
And in reading the book, a lot of the narrative sounds like it was maybe tape recorded, or it was given to you, or you wrote it down. How did that work?
Yeah, all of those things. Questionnaires, one-on-one interviews. I interviewed all of the veterans at least twice, some of them many more times than that. I brought 9 of them. My husband and I took a class here at C3 TV on how to do a program. And then with the help of Terry and Susan Johnson, I brought 9 of the veterans in. And Jack Bonino, who's the director of counseling at the Non-Vet Center, I gave him a series of questions. Truthfully, questions I didn't really think they would answer for me, really intimate and personal questions. And so there were 9 of them here on the stage, and Jack, 3 hours. He asked them all these questions, and they were just unbelievable. They were so candid and so truthful. And so I had all of that, and I had tape recorded every one of the interviews. So then the absolutely worst, most awful part of the whole book was transcribing all of that. I'd never do that again. That was just awful, time-consuming, when I'd rather have been doing anything else. So next time I'd hire somebody to help me with that. But so I had a tremendous amount of information, and then the next step was figuring out how to put that into some kind of a narrative.
Right. Well, speaking of that, how long did it take, this whole process? You say you've been writing this all your life, but this actual book, how long did that take?
2012, I started the first interview, and in 2014 we came back for 3 months, and I redid all of the interviews, and I think 2015, the beginning of that, was the last actual interview I did. And then after that, it was a matter of pulling it all together.
And then pulling it all together, what you did with that, I noticed there are different sections in the book, and I think it's very interesting how you organize the sections. I'm trying to find the first part is entitled, "It Mattered to Me Growing Up in America and Arriving in Vietnam." That's the first section. How did you arrive at that particular title for that section?
Well, I have to back up a step, and this is one of the things I'm proudest of. Initially, there were 17 sections. Each veteran had a big story, beginning, middle, and end. And one day I was reading over the manuscript, and I had this just terrible moment where I realized that what I had done was I did just what the military did to the veterans. I had separated each of them and made each one a person by themselves with no connection to Vietnam, no connection to any of their friends who were also veterans. And I thought, this isn't what I want to tell in this story. I want the reader to be in 1964, 1970, and get an idea of what America was like at that time, what the family life were like of these 17 people who were about to have their lives changed. And so I'm a poet, okay? So I said, well, okay, so what I'll do is I'll make one section before Vietnam. And I think everybody expects that section 2 is going to be in country, but that's not my story to tell. That's not my book. And so I was very clear with them. If you want to talk about Vietnam, it's going to be in a remembrance of something else or because of something else. So the second section is immediately coming home. And so with section 1, a lot of them, because either they found it difficult to talk to people, or people just didn't care, or people were incredibly disrespectful. I heard 4 or 5 times, but it mattered to me. It mattered that I was in Vietnam. It mattered that I now have a leg full of shrapnel. It mattered that I left what would have been a different life. So I thought, I really thought that was a really good beginning for the book.
How could it not matter when you think of what they went through? Those of us of a certain age remember those times and remember the problem with everyone hating the war got translated into disliking the people who happened to be the ones that were sent there to do the job. And
right. There's a heartbreaking story of a veteran who went in to a sandwich shop with his sister to get a peanut butter sandwich because he couldn't get one in Vietnam, and a 7-year-old spit on him.
It was a terrible time for our country as well as everybody.
Well, they came home and the country was at war with them.
Yes, so, that's right, exactly, and it was an unfortunate time. So the second section is called Losses and Crosses, Coping with Coming Home, and that's exactly what we've been talking about in the last minute or two. Talk about that a little.
Well, that's a set of words that one of the veterans actually says. And I think, if I remember, in that section, he's talking about not only did he have the losses that he was dealing with about Vietnam, but he got married, and then there were crosses and losses that he and his wife had to deal with. So I think that they're two very different things. I think that they say two different things, and if you spend a minute with losses and crosses, especially the way Peter O'Donnell, the veteran who said it, the way he talks about it with his wife, I think it's an important thing.
Right. One of the things that I was struck by and made the book very real to me, made all of the veterans very real to me, were all the pictures. In the middle section of the book, all of these people I had been reading about, and I didn't skip to the middle of the book to look at the pictures first, but then I started seeing all the pictures of the various veterans, and both in the early moments of their lives as well as later. And I thought those were really striking and very, very important to the book.
Thank you.
The third section is entitled Language of a Single Tear. This is your poetry coming out. I can see that. Post-traumatic stress and self-imposed silence. That's a powerful title. Would you like
to? Well, the third section is the 40 years since Vietnam, and each of the veterans sort of uses that differently to talk about what that 40 years has been like. And some of them did incredibly well for many years. Some of them did well right up until now, but there was a point for a lot of them where things begin to break down just a little bit. And many of them talk about their post-traumatic stress. Many of them talk there was suicide. One of the sections that my beta readers, 2 of them told me they weren't going to read the rest of the book after they got to one section, because there's an adorable photograph of Pauline Hebert with her pigtails, and she talks about being a tomboy. And then you continue to read what she has to say, and she is very, very upfront about what Vietnam, being in Vietnam, did to her and the cost to her. And one of the pictures in there is her holding her cat, which is just an adorable picture, except if you've read what happens in that section, she tells you that a cat actually saved her life when she was about to kill herself one day. So I think that section is really important. It isn't just fluff. It isn't just, well, I had a great life. There's a policeman in there that tells you that carried a weapon, and he was a policeman, and that he also was having trouble with memories and with thoughts, and so people were very candid in that section.
It also brings up the cat analogy, brings up the issue of the dogs and the cats and the various pets that are emotional helps
Yes.
to the veterans, as they are to people in various other kinds of stressful and post-traumatic stress disorder problems, not necessarily from the war, but from other things.
Two of the veterans that came to the presentation at the Cultural Center at Cape Cod the other night, one of them is Preston Hood, who is quite deaf from Vietnam, and he has Gilmore, who's a safety hearing dog who alerts him to smoke alarms or doorbells or any of that kind of thing. And Ron Dunning, who has an enormous dog, a shepherd, an enormous dog, which is an anxiety dog. So two of the dogs were actually at the performance the other night. So it was wonderful to see them, but they're very, very helpful.
Oh yeah, I think they are lifesavers in a lot of ways.
Especially for Preston, because his hearing is so bad that he could definitely miss an alarm or something.
Right. The final section is called Still Twisted, Resiliency and Outreach. Can you describe what you mean by those words?
Sure. Actually, one of the veterans in the book says that he's still twisted in that he hasn't still figured out that his 12 months in Vietnam has to do with his life today. That there isn't just a straight line from in combat to you're 72 years old or whatever. So that was really part of it. Another part of it is that many of the veterans and much of the research I did says that after coming home, treatment of some kind is a really good idea. Well, we don't debrief people for a month or something after they come home from war. We just bring them home and send them back into the community. But some of the veterans, it took them until just recently to be able to start to deal with the fact that Vietnam had something to do with their relationship with their wives, and many of them have had more than one wife, or with their children. So part of it has to do with that kind of thing. Another one of the veterans gave me a very interesting piece of information, and because most people say get treatment, get into some kind of a therapy group or a rap group with other like veterans. But this one man said that he would like to say that. He would like to say, come home and get treatment right away. But he said in some cases, having post-traumatic stress really does well by you depending upon the job you're going to go into. A lot of veterans like that adrenaline high. They function really, really well in the real world depending upon the job. And one of the veterans, if you've read the book, is very candid about the job that he did when he came back and how that post-traumatic stress helped him. So that was kind of a twist on the story of veterans coming home.
I noticed, I don't know the numbers, but it seemed to me a number of the veterans were in police work or in fire work. That how common was that in the group, the 17 that you interviewed?
I think there are 5. There was one man that was a U.S. Marshal. There was a fireman, an EMT, and two policemen. So 5 out of 17.
That's pretty high percentage when you consider the general population. That's certainly higher than the general population would be. Now, I've noticed that most of these veterans were from Massachusetts. Is that correct?
Initially, many of them grew up in other places, New York, California. But the interesting thing about the book is they all ended up living in New England. And because I started at the Non-Vets Association here in Hyannis, so most of them live here in the Cape. A couple live in Fairhaven and New Bedford, Maine, New Hampshire. So they've settled in New England, the majority of them right here on Cape Cod.
Did you get a sense that they would like to have had better response from the Veterans Administration?
What I found was that many of them didn't trust the VA enough to get involved. that when they came back, they wanted as little to do with the Veterans Administration. But when they did get involved, because PTSD was only brand newly named
Right.
In those years, so that even if you went, there wouldn't have been a recognition of what it is. There is a story of somebody who took themselves into an emergency room and said, I'm not safe, I'm going to hurt myself. And the person suggested that they drive themselves to a psychiatric hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But the recognition that it maybe had something to do with Vietnam really wasn't there. The wonderful thing about the book, and we just did a presentation at, I have to get this right, the VA hospital healthcare system in Leeds, Massachusetts. Maybe that's not all the words, but the veterans call it Northampton, and it's a VA hospital.
Yes, I noticed this in the book.
Yeah, and I had to kind of keep doing that back and forth because some call it Leeds and some call it Northampton. But as far as Northampton, almost every one of them went to Northampton and received treatment there, and they all benefit from it.
Which always reminds me is that it all boils down to the people involved in treatment in any facility.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that Northampton was mentioned several times in the book,
Yes.
I noticed. And so they must have been doing the right thing there. That at least it seemed that way to me.
I didn't meet a veteran who had a bad experience there.
Yeah. How did you find a publisher? I think you mentioned you had a publisher before you actually began this. Is that correct?
I didn't have a publisher. I had somebody who said that they were interested in the book, and that didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 42 rejections.
No, only 42.
42 rejections. Many of them were, it's so traditionally set up incorrectly that if you put it back into 17 sections, then we'll publish it. And I was like, this book is set up exactly the way it needs to be set up in order to honor the veteran service.
Mm-hmm.
So no. So I did, believe it or not, have to say no to two publishers. A quick story at the end, I was just about ready to think about self-publishing it, because I just know that it needs to be out there. People need to read it right this minute, not another 4 years from now. And at the end of a year ago, I went back through the year and looked at all the query letters I sent out. And I had three agencies that hadn't gotten back to me. And so I said, I'm just going to write to them. So I sent them all a quick thing saying, gee, I didn't hear back from you. I'm sorry, maybe I missed your email. And McFarland got back to me and said, are you sure you didn't hear back from us? Because we really like this. And I was like, oh my gosh. So McFarland...
Time is short. I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
Vietnam Veterans Unbroken by Jacqueline Murray Lorning. And I can't recommend this book enough. I think it tells us so much about veterans that we need to know. And it tells them from the standpoint of the veterans themselves. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for interviewing me.